Hello and welcome to PCG Live. In this episode, we're going to be discussing what's happening in freelancing across the world with Ken Phillips, who's co-founder and executive director of Independent Contractors Australia, with Professor Patricia Leighton, who recently conducted research into freelancing across Europe, and Simon McVicker, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at PCG, which is the UK's membership organisation for freelancers. Simon, let me start with you then. It's quite striking, really, that freelancing is growing across the world in countries, regardless almost of their different economic situations. Why would that be the case, do you think?
Well, I think that, economies have become more flexible over the last 10 to 15 years. I think people have chosen freelancing for personal lifestyle reasons. But I also think that businesses, big businesses, are looking for flexible solutions. They're looking for people to come in, do projects and then leave. They're not wanting to take on the headcount in the way they were before. And we are seeing with the Bank of England and people like that are coming to us now and they're saying, is there a change in our economy? Is there a structural change in the economy? The consistent growth of freelancing since the early 2000s is suggesting to us that this is not cyclical anymore, but the way we're working and the way we want to work is changing, and they're asking us here in PCG to go out and do some research and provide them with evidence of this.
And Ken, in Australia, what is the situation in terms of the growth of freelancers?
Surprisingly, over the last 2 to 3 years, it's actually dropped back. And that's been the result of some intense regulatory or re-regulation in the space, particularly around tax. But if we look at the longer term issue, it's certainly continuing to grow. And there's a surprising growth through Asia as well. And as an example, the managing director of a large IT recruitment firm that I know was telling me that about 3 years ago, when they were recruiting out of Malaysia, Singapore, Japan and so forth, that people were saying, oh, look, they want to be an employee in a company. And he was saying that just 3 years later, everyone's asking to be a freelancer, an independent contractor, self-employed. And he said it's really quite changed the whole scope of how they approach their business. And I think we're seeing this on a global scale, and it's driven very much through attitudes. People are not looking to a firm any longer to give them a life's process. People are more looking to themselves and are saying, how do I get out there and make myself a business, and security of income comes through me, not through someone else. Because the firm really, in terms of it's supplying security of income for people, has just collapsed as a model. People know it can't do it anymore. And so security comes through the self. So I think that's really the big driver that's coming through.
Patricia, what's the situation across Europe?
Yes, well, it does vary across Europe. I mean, generally speaking, over the last decade, we've seen a massive growth of 45%. In some countries, it's even more dramatic. It's over 90%. And so it's well worth asking, why is this happening? I would agree with Ken. I think that you do see variations across different states within the EU, which included, of course, the UK. And clearly, there are regulatory issues which do impact on the attractiveness of this way of working. I would also agree, though, that my own research showed that a major driver is the rejection of standard employment. And people are saying, my organisation's just removed my occupational pension, they treat me like rubbish, managerialism, all these factors are hugely important. That doesn't seem to depend a great deal on which country you're in. That is just a very strong driver, generally. So my feeling is that we need to look at both the reasons that make working for yourself more attractive, and then we have to look at the reasons why working for yourself become even more attractive because of government policies and other matters. I think what's significant about Europe, though, is the two new significant groups that are attracted to freelance working. One is young people, straight from education. are not doing that traditional path of having what you might call a proper job and then building up networks and contacts and then moving to self-employment. It is that they are seeing this as a straight choice. And I'm attracted to this and I'm going to get going straight away. So particularly in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, possibly the northern European states, we're seeing this as quite a marked phenomenon. The other one, of course, is the growth of older people post-retirement, euphemistically referred to as active ageing, are attracted to continue working. And these are the groups that are particularly attractive, I think, we were talking earlier, Ken, particularly attractive to employing organisations because they retain their skills.
There are some very interesting variables which we'll come to in a minute in terms of different countries within Europe and in terms of the growth or not of freelancers. But Ken, I'm quite interested to know from you what the primary issues that independent professionals face in Australia. You mentioned tax earlier. Can you just expand on that?
We've had some very strict... People probably don't understand the extent to which the administration of tax laws enables someone to be self-employed or not. So, for example, Australia over the last 5 years, the tax office, this is not a piece of legislation, but the tax office just determined that anyone who was a labourer couldn't be classified as self-employed. Now, that was just an administrative decision of the tax office. Very strange. So in Australia, if you're to be self-employed, you have to have what's called an Australian business number. That has to be quoted on every tax invoice. And if it's not quoted, you effectively can't invoice people. So they've been rejecting labourers and others from having an Australian business number, which means that you can't issue a tax invoice, which means you can't run your business. So this is an extremely oppressive form of suppression of the right of people to be self-employed through a tax administration process. And rather an ugly side of what's gone on in Australia over about the last 4 or 5 years, which we're hoping will change. So I think people, and particularly governments and in our society, don't understand the extent to which the administration of government impacts on this new wave that's coming through. And it's a key area for governments and for our societies to understand.
What is the thinking behind the suppression, as you put it, of people being able to go self-employed?
From the tax officer's point of view, and I had several debates with tax officials in Australia, and I complained to them about they've never been in business and they've always worked in the public sector. And one of them I was having a strong debate with here said, well, look, I've worked in the public sector for 43 years. Quite proud of it. So literally, culturally, within their own life experience, their concept of a business has to be something that is employing people, it's a shop or something they can see. So when people become iPros, become freelancers, become independent contractors in all sorts of areas, and I'm one of those, the very fact of a person being a single, warm human being a business is something that they conceptually find very, very difficult to comprehend. There's a strong cultural issue here.
It seems incredibly old-fashioned. Patricia, what do you make of that?
Yes, I would agree with that. I'd also want to say that I think one of the big issues is this feeling, suspicion of people who are freelance. Quote, they're fiddling their tax, they're fiddling their expenses. And there is a huge rhetoric around this. But also, unfortunately, on the part of politicians and policymakers, they tend to believe it. And when I was doing interviews with people across the EU, a different issue emerged, which was to deter them, or rather was a negative factor. It wasn't so much, and I think it was remarkable, that not a single person said to me they thought the tax level was too high. What they were saying was, you have to look at this in the round. It's social security contributions, which are very high. And I'm shocked because I'm also a freelancer. And it's very, very high compared to an employee. And yet in some states, not all by any means, but in some states, you can't have access to benefits. And I think that it is a sense of unfairness and injustice which is the concern, not so much the fact of any level of tax or anything like that. So I think that more or less came from all people, from people in all the EU states I was involved in.
I can give a very specific example where, certainly in Australia, the tax office, I've been quite aware of some situations where the tax office has said to people who have had to fly interstate to see a client that they would deny them the cost of the flight as a tax deductible item because they were travelling to and from work. Right, now, that's demonstrably stupid. And so when you get little examples like that, you understand the level of stupidity that's going on here.
Simon, what do you make of all of this? Because we have our issues in this country
Yes,
too when
we
it
do.
comes to tax and perhaps a level of suspicion, but nothing on that scale.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean,
Really?
the whole basis of this conversation is around recognition of freelancers as genuine, smallest businesses in our economy. They're not vulnerable workers. They're not tax dodgers.
No.
They're driving our economy. They're helping economic recovery. And the policymakers don't always get this, and therefore they then pass legislation which doesn't recognise freelancing. We've had it in this country with our IR35. We see it in lots of pieces of HMRC legislation. There's one going through at the moment called the onshore intermediaries legislation, where they're trying their best to define us outside this legislation, but can't 100% do it because they're not 100% certain. So, it may be an education thing. I think it is beginning to change. I am getting more positive noises from our Labour Party, for instance, who was always traditionally hostile. There is a debate going on because at the end of the day, the figures speak for themselves. The growth is huge. The politicians can't ignore us because in a way, they have to recognise the workforce in order to develop the tax system in a way that will get revenue in. So as the numbers continue to grow, I think we'll get the recognition.
Right, let's look at the problem or the issue from a different point of view, Ken, and that is perhaps trying to sell the idea of independent professionals by how much they contribute to the economy. In the UK, independent professionals contributed £95 billion to the economy in 2013. Presumably their contribution is similarly measured in Australia.
We always have trouble with the statistics and defining where it falls in and so forth. Probably the best statistic I can give in Australia, which sort of summarises the Australian situation, there's roughly, out of a population of 11.5 million, there's roughly 2 million people who are self-employed. Half of those people, little under half of those people, don't employ anyone else. I'm one of those type of people. And the other percentage of self-employed, so it's about 1.1 million, employ people and employ up to about 4 or 5 each on average. When you take that as the small business owners of Australia, the people that they then employ, the total workforce in that small business group is 7.5 of the 11.5 million workforce. Now, this is the dominant sector of the workforce. It contributes in the order of 65%, in the order of 55% of the Australian economy. And for example, in the Australian economy, we've got the big end of town and the mining sector is a massive contributor to it. But still, it's swamped by the scale of the small end of town. So on any measure, the reality is that if the policy settings on this sector of the community are not right, you don't get any of your policy settings right. You fail totally across the board because of the impact on both GDP contribution, but the raw number of people who are actually working and making a decent living.
I mean, we've got evidence that shows that companies that use freelancers actually create more employment in the long run because they can test markets, they can test things out, and when they get some certainty, they'll take on more people on a permanent basis. So in fact, there is academic work by Professor Burke which shows those companies that use freelancers actually create, in the end, more employment.
Patricia, what about figures across Europe? I talked about different variables of the number of freelancers, the growth of freelancers in different countries, and it'd be interesting to hear from you about that, but also in terms of their contribution to the different economies.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there are a number of countries within the EU which are what we might call IPRO savvy. I mean, they are aware that this is a significant group. There are other countries that are pretty, they really haven't gone down this route at all. I just want to say one thing, Aasmah, which is really about what struck me when talking to policymakers as well as independent professionals and things, is just how powerful still the European social model is. And this is a model based on a kind of social contract between the individual and the state. And a lot of people spoke to me about how suspicious politicians are about people who don't conform. And they do talk about this. They don't conform, these people. They're awkward. They insist on talking about themselves. They talk about autonomy and independence.
Individualism is a terrible thing.
Really,
Shocking, isn't
really
it?
difficult. And of course, strong forces in most European states are trade unions who are also resistant to this group, becoming stronger in the workforce. Those countries that still strongly adhere to the social model are sometimes reluctant to do the research which shows how useful these people are. I think this is changing, but I would say that the countries in the EU which have embraced this most strongly are ourselves, actually, who do seem to know the numbers, and the comments about the Governor of the Bank of England being interested and all that. The Dutch are, I think, the brand leaders across the EU because they have achieved recognition by government. They have achieved what might be called, well, to call it a collective agreement is a kind of a bit odd to use that phrase. Interestingly, the Poles as well, and the Finns. So there are countries which have got a developed market, or it's rapidly developing, where the issues of contribution and people talk about agility, collaboration, and are part of this, sorry, I'm going to sound like an academic now, this discourse, which is about new ways of working. And a lot of people, one thing we haven't mentioned is that in some countries there are new business models emerging. There are quite dramatically different ways of delivering services, and I would include my own profession, which is lawyers, and there are other, the liberal professions which are trailblazing there. So you do get a bit of a north-south divide, as usual, but there is some good practice there, and there are some countries who are embracing it. And I would say from Southern Europe, Spain is another country which is working to provide a definition, which has to be the starting point, and from which you then develop policy.
I've got a couple of questions that people sent in on email. This is from Tony Phillips. Politicians in the UK say they champion small businesses but do very little for us when it comes to policy. Is this the same in Australia and the rest of Europe? So is it the same in Australia?
Oh my goodness, is it? It's love us by ministerial press release. And lots of pats on the back and well done, keep up the good work, all that sort of thing. And then when it comes down to the hard wire, it's, minister, society will cease to function if we actually do something here. And there's a very practical side of it. Fortunately, with the PCG, you've got a very strong organisation that gets in there and lobbies. But what I would refer to as the big end of town and those who have vested interests to ensure that the small people don't get up, spend a lot of time and money on lobbyists getting what they want. And so the little people don't, as a general rule, have that time and money to be able to get in there and lobby the cause and get that. And we're being far too fiercely independent for our own good on so many occasions. So absolutely yes.
Let me just play devil's advocate for a minute, because I sense that there is a feeling that that governments have there's a level of suspicion from governments about freelancers because they don't conform, because they don't go to an office 9 to 5. Is some of that to do with the government worrying about certain people, perhaps who are new to freelancing, being exploited?
Well, that's what the politicians like to talk about, of course, especially on the left.
Is there a grain of truth in it?
Oh, look, there's
well,
no
there
question.
will be.
There's
yes.
no question.
I mean, there are.
Let us take one specific issue: late payment of freelancers or non-payment of freelancers. What we know is from the data that the circumstances where late or non-payment occurs is where the sum of money involved is fairly small and the person to whom it is owed is very small. that's classically the freelancer. And you can turn blue in the face saying to policymakers, look, there are two reasons why this needs to be addressed in a much more solid way than you have already. First of all, a freelancer will say, well, I'm not going to make a fuss, because if I do make a fuss, it's difficult to get another contract. And the other one is, and I speak as a lawyer now, and I know that what is important in law is not the legal rules. Europe has a Small Business Act which says it's now solved this problem by laying down some rules. But the fact of the matter is they're pretty unenforceable, because in order to get your £500 or whatever it is, you have to spend that amount of money going to the county court and all the delays and we know that litigation makes people very angry and upset. You know, my main object in life is to keep people out of law courts. And so, you know, a simple area like that, and they are not willing to take some small steps which can be taken to actually set up systems which do help the freelancer.
So why do you think they're unwilling?
Don't know how to do it.
No,
and there are some very simple solutions. There are probably two really aspects here. I'm completely unimpressed that the current regime of employment law prevents exploitation of people. Yeah. It just doesn't do it. In the freelance space, there's absolutely no question we need some very simple processes to assist the prevention of exploitation. And we're very fortunate in Australia. We've been pushing on this very hard and very keen to push these sorts of ideas here. And what Pat's referring to is very cheap, simple and quick dispute resolution procedures, which aren't highly legalistic. And if you've got a £1,000 dispute, you don't spend £500, £800 or £1,500 getting it resolved, but you can get it done nice and quickly. And the other area of progressing, which is probably a little bit more controversial, is the area of fair contract laws in Australia. And we've the new government in Australia has got a firm commitment to that. So I'm of the view that we can get some nice, quick, but very substantial regulation space that will squash exploitation more effectively than what we see in the employment space.
Can I just come in this? Because I think it is actually quite obvious when people are being exploited. I mean, you know, if your local hotel is forcing all its chambermaids to set up limited companies so the hotel chain doesn't have to pay them as much as much tax, that is an obvious case. And you know what, HMRC know that. But you know, if you're a project manager or a business analyst or something like that, and you're working for, you know, RBS or whatever, and you've got a project that lasts 6 months, and you've got good expertise in that area, I mean, you know, that is also obvious, and it's obvious that you're not being exploited. And I think that it suits some people on the left of politics, and indeed in the European Union, to set up these arguments deliberately to knock down the true freelancer.
And there's almost an agenda to ensure that exploitation remains possible, rather than putting in some institutions that can fix this quite simply. Because if the solutions are not put on the table, then you can maintain the argument that this is all bad.
Can I also add that one of the things that strikes me is a lot of the people we're talking about are very creative, they're very bright, they're very... The politicians we talk to haven't got a creative solution in their head. And they are programmed to go down a particular route to deal with a particular problem, whether you're in the UK or whether you're sitting in Brussels or whether you're in another member state of the EU. And there's a total... They trumpet the words innovation, agility, like nobody's business. When it comes to actually looking at what they're proposing, it's the same old solutions. Go to a law court, do this, get help in other way. And so the lack of creative thinking is a real issue, I think, when you've got such creative people that they're trying to deal with.
Some of the greatest exploitation that occurs is freelancers and independent contractors who have a contract with a government agency and just watch the hoops that you're put through if you want to get some level of justice out of government departments. So if we're going to really look at fixing these sorts of things, let's start, number one, at government and their policies and their behaviours.
It's interesting, every discussion that we have, that's something that comes up. Just finally then, I'll be interested to know what all three of you think we could be doing better, what we could take from other countries. For example, Ken, with the UK situation, is there a particular model or initiative here or an aspect of freelancing that you think that you would like to take back with you, if you could? Simon, similarly, is there anything in Australia, perhaps along, I don't know, fair contract law, etc., that we could use here?
Look, probably the first one is that I've been watching your IR35 debate since 2000 and watching it very closely. I am extremely derogatory of it and the solution you've got. And in actual fact, the solutions we've got under tax administration law are better than what you've got. So I think that the UK, the people here need a good swift kick to get this thing fixed in the UK, because it hasn't been fixed. That'd sort of be one of my takes from what I've watched of the UK.
I mean, but this all goes back to the recognition factor, and indeed, probably the Australian contractors and our members have similar type problems. I think Patricia mentioned the Dutch, and the very fact that the Dutch contractors or freelancers have now managed to get themselves into the dialogue with government as a recognised partner with the employers and employees is a very great success for them, because that means that all policy-making decisions at government level have to take freelancers into consideration. And that would be an ideal position for us to get into, that every time a consultation goes out, our view is equal to that of the CBIs and the TUCs. That would be great.
What is it about the Dutch model, by the way? Because it's 93% growth or something like that in terms of independent professionals?
Yes, well, I think it's a combination of an intrinsic flexibility of outlook that the Dutch have. I think you can see that through their willingness to, speak different languages, work in different ways. I think they have some academics there who have, over the last few years, created a literature for the first time, from organisational behaviour to management issues. And I think it's to do with their type of government, which, because of the multiplicity of parties, etc., it gives an opportunity, quite contrast actually with Australia, where it gives an ability for you to creep in through a door to get access. But one thing I wanted to say really about the EU is that, and about the question about what can we do to improve and what are the issues. Well, first of all, I think sharing knowledge is absolutely critical. And I think a lot is going on now, and we're realising that we're not in isolation. I think there's a tendency for freelance working, because the individuals are individuals, to actually stay within your little box, really. And I think that reaching out is now happening, and we can get the best practices and we can look at where it's successful. Secondly, I think we can measure how governments perform and what is going on. That you've asked the question about the Netherlands. What's good in the Netherlands? And there are a whole range of issues about education and training. Do schools prepare people for working independently? Do they see it as a legitimate choice, or do they see it as failure or a second-rate choice? What about the support for people to continue training? What about the system of support when you're ill, when you have an accident? And so you can develop, and we have done that. We've just begun this process of looking at European states to look at a number of criteria and to score, just to score how individual states are doing. And from that, you can see straight away who's the leading one, who's got the best points out of 10, as it were, on the X factor. And it's the Netherlands. I have to say, though, the UK does score quite well. And you can see one or two countries where, if you make a rational decision as an educated European young person where you're going to go and work, there are some countries you would not go to.
Interesting. Well, on that cliffhanger, we'll leave it. Just very quickly, Patricia, you did mention your recent research on Europe. Where can people watching find that research?
Simon, this is it.
Yes, it's on the EFIP website.
Ideal present for
www.efip.org.
There you go. Very bright, very cheerful. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Ken Phillips, Professor Patricia Leighton and Simon McVicker for joining us. And thank you for watching. Tune in for the next episode in May for another debate on what's happening in freelancing. Goodbye.